Hi, hope everyone's well. So, recently in the news, not the main broadcast news, but online news that I've been seeing, there has been reports about tensions in I was going to say Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, rather, with reports that the Chinese um, that is mainland China, has been flying jets over Taiwanese airspace. Now, the Daily Express has been reporting this, and to be honest, I always take the Daily Express slightly with a pinch of salt because they have long engaged in hyperbole of a lot of things. I mean, whenever there's tensions with Russia, they warn of World War Three, and once again, World War Three. I made a video once about the concept of World War Three or a global conflict. I think that's a very specific thing, and I think it takes several factors. It's an interesting subject. It's a very grave subject, but it's an interesting one. Um, I don't think it's going to be that, but it could be a serious situation. So, although the Daily Express is prone to hyperbole, I definitely think there's no escaping the fact that there are tensions in that part of the world, and I can understand Taipei being very concerned. There's no way that Taiwan can take on mainland China by itself. So it relies on stronger countries, stronger territories to stronger countries, I should say, to do that. Now, whether this latest escalation is a response to the British vessel sailing through the Taiwan Strait, sort of Beijing saying, well, you're going to do that, we're going to do this. It's almost like Cold War games. Now, just for the record, surprise, surprise, I support the Royal Navy sailing through the Taiwan Strait. Some might say that's provocative. Some might say, well, why do that? It just provokes Beijing. But the point about it was, and this is what the MOD had said, it's to demonstrate freedom of navigation. That's international water. And it's the same principle about sailing through the Black Sea last month. I think it was last month. Again, to point out to Russia, this is freedom of navigation. Now, in that situation, there was a bit of a standoff, and apparently warning shots were fired. On this occasion, Beijing was all bark and no bite, i.e., they didn't really do anything. Now, I don't believe that that is Beijing just being merciful, and I think it's actually because, despite all its jingoism, despite all its chest thumping, um, mainland China might not be as powerful as it seems. Now, don't get me wrong, I would never ever underestimate it. It's a powerful country, and in the head-to-head fight between the UK and China right now, head-to-head. The only thing we would really have on our side is battle experience, i.e., we have been in active conflicts. China hasn't. That's probably the only thing we would have on our side. We have a bigger economy, have a bigger military. So in a head-to-head between the UK and China, we'd have some serious trouble. I'm not naive about that. But China cannot take on democracies when they're combined. I'm not just talking about the Five Eyes, incidentally, or the AUKUS, AUKUS. There's other vested interests. The new Japanese Prime Minister, Mr. Kishida, is very assertive with China. That's good. I think the more democracies take an assertive line with China, the better. Because we cannot have a situation where the Beijing regime keeps behaving as it does in its belligerent wolf warrior way, wolf warrior diplomacy. It's not diplomacy, it's threats. What's interesting, and I mentioned this in a previous video, is now they're having this coal situation. Apparently, they're having to beg Australia for help. Well, I really, really hope Australia draws that out and puts the Chinese regime on the spot, because the very same regime was threatening to destroy the Australian wine industry not long ago because Australia called for an independent inquiry into COVID. The Chinese have to understand. by which I mean the Chinese government. Well, no, I extend that to Chinese nationals. They have to understand that respect is a two-way street. You can't just demand and demand and demand respect, but show none in return. I mean, as an example of what we are seeing here, I've watched the latest Bond film, No Time to Die. I may or may not do a review of that. I thought mostly it was a good movie, but this is not about that. But I was just looking up James Bond information online, particularly about this film, and there was an article that caught my attention because it said why China can never be featured in a James Bond plot. Now, and the report argued that since 1997, with 7 years in Tibet, Hollywood has been super careful with China on the grounds that China is a huge potential market. Chinese Film Board only allows, I believe the figure is 7 Hollywood films a year. Now, officially, this is to give domestic films a chance, but really, it's probably more to do with the fact they don't want some of the ideas of Western films getting into the Chinese market. For example, standing up to totalitarianism as one instance. Um, I know that when Skyfall was released, there was a subplot involving China, whereby the main protagonist had been tortured by the Chinese regime. Apparently, that was totally censored. The film wasn't banned in China. Skyfall did show, and it was pretty successful in China. But a significant part of it takes place in Shanghai, and the main villain, like a lot of the villains of the Craig era, he's ambiguous, morally ambiguous because he has a sympathetic backstory, i.e., he was a British spy who felt betrayed by MI6 and he was tortured by the Chinese. Now, they totally cut that storyline, ignoring the fact it's just a film, it's fiction, it's not meant to be, literal. Although Russia had similar nerves when Olga Kurylenko, despite the fact she's Ukrainian, she was cast in Quantum of Solace. So, these great powers, these rising superpowers, Russia and China, for all their tough talk, they're actually pretty thin-skinned. And it's ironic, recently Xi Jinping has waged war against his regime has waged war against what they see as insidious culture, Chinese celebrities who are too promiscuous or whatever. But one of the things they've attacked is effeminate men, because they have in mind C-pop, Chinese pop stars. But that's ironic because Xi Jinping, this is a man who had Winnie the Pooh banned in China because some netizens were unfavorably comparing him to the character. So Xi Jinping is very thin-skinned. This is the thing with totalitarians in general. They may be threatening, thuggish, but they're actually like little boys. And they're like I'm biased. I do not like Xi Jinping. I do not like the vile regime he presides over. I just think it's ironic, isn't it, that he's taken all these, he's pushing all these campaigns to ban aspects of culture, but he is so thin-skinned. I mean, China has a lot of bark, but I wonder how much bite it really has. It may well be that one mistake we're making in the West is overestimating the power of China. I mean, if a little country like Lithuania, and I mean that with the greatest of respect, it's a small country, 3 million people. If it can stand up to China, then great powers like Britain, France, Canada, etc., have no excuse. I think that we've fallen into a trap in the West where we believe that China is so powerful that it cannot be touched. We better not criticize him. I think some of it's greed, certainly in the case of university departments, certainly in the case of Hollywood. It's interesting because a lot of the vintage Bond films, and indeed a lot of films from Hollywood throughout the period of the Cold War, focus on the Cold War. They focus on the Soviet Union being the great protagonist. Rocky Four comes to mind. A lot of the vintage Bond films. So there was never a fear of, oh well, we better not offend the Soviets. Why is there this fear of offending Beijing? Well, it's the commercial side of it. And I get that. Ultimately, it's a business. Ultimately, filmmakers and studios want to make money. So they're careful about not offending the Chinese market. And it isn't just the Chinese government. I mean, nationalism is drilled in to, to the Chinese population. It is one of the biggest tools they have, actually. And I think it's something that is not spoken about enough in the West. We talk about the Chinese government, we talk about the human rights abuses, we talk about their belligerent, hawkish behavior. But one thing we don't talk about enough is how ultranationalism is utilized. I mean, defending the motherland, it's just inbuilt into the mindset there. So I do feel, and I want to be careful how I say this, I do feel that a lot of the Chinese diaspora, and I'm talking about students in particular, but others as well, I think they are exploited by Beijing. Now, they get worked up by this. They say, "Oh, we're not the government. Don't conflate us with the CCP." My response to that is fair enough. You're not. So don't then go out of your way to defend the CCP. I really take the view you cannot complain if people are being wary of you, if you're in another country and you're being openly nationalistic and defending a regime that many people around the world despise. I mean, in the last couple of years, China's reputation has been utterly, utterly damaged. It's never been great, but I think with coronavirus and the handling of COVID and the way they've tried to, pass blame, I think that Beijing's reputation in the last 2 years has been absolutely, in the West right now, it's at rock bottom, except for some useful idiots. Other countries that have very close trade links with China, like Pakistan and some small Pacific Island nations, unfortunately are a lot more reliant on Beijing. And there are people who I remember coming across a young Chinese news presenter. She called herself a freelance journalist, but like most Chinese journalists, she had to answer to the CCP. That's how it works. She was in Egypt and she was talking about how the Western media portrays China, and Egyptians were lining up to agree with her. Now, whether that was she was an attractive young woman, whether it was something to do with that, or whether it was just this reliance factor. Um, it's a kind of sickening irony that one of the biggest mass persecutions of the 21st century against the Uyghur Muslims is largely ignored by Islamic State. Yeah, they have no problem condemning President Macron or other Western leaders for alleged Islamophobia. The hypocrisy is pathetic. But anyway, getting back to this issue in the Taiwan Strait, I don't think war is going to break out because although Beijing is hawkish, it's not stupid. But there is a risk that they see Biden as a soft touch. Biden still has to prove himself. I think a lot of his rhetoric is right. He talks about human rights. He talks about the need to be tough with China. Um, but words are not enough. If you're taking a hard line, you have to follow it up. I would totally favor sanctions against Beijing even further, not against China, the country, but against CCP officials. Of course, they'll distort it. They'll say oh, this is against the Chinese people. But really, I think we need to see what's going on here. We need to recognize, and by we, I'm talking about free nations. We need to see that we cannot just optimistically hope that this situation is going to change. Oh, well, as the Chinese economy grows, they'll reform, they'll get more moderate. The exact opposite is happening. The exact opposite is happening. Now, if China decides to retake Taiwan by force, Taiwanese people don't want that, but if that was to be the case, the United States will be obliged to defend Taiwan, and then it's going to be a very, very serious situation. Australia, Japan, the UK will inevitably be drawn in. I think even though the UK isn't a Pacific power, I think morally we could not ignore that situation. And I really, really do see echoes of the 1930s. Forget the Cold War. I see echoes of the 1930s here because you have a rising power that is increasingly militaristic, increasingly nationalistic, plays the victim. I think there's a lot of analogies. The racial component, not so much. However, I would argue there is a Sino supremacy. One little subtle example of this, and it's people might think it's not a big issue, but when we hear this propaganda, 5,000 years of Chinese history, it's dubious, actually. Now, China is an ancient land, has a very long recorded history, but technically that's 3,600 years, roughly speaking. If we go to the Shang Dynasty, and I've studied history closely, I'd say I have a pretty good grasp of history. Shang Dynasty goes back roughly 3,600 years. The Xia Dynasty, even Chinese historians say it's semi-mythical. It's more about folk tales and so on. The Shang Dynasty was historic, about 3,600 years. It's ancient. It's one of the world's oldest civilizations in terms of recorded history. So people might say, what does it matter, 3,600 years, 5,000 years? It matters because Chinese nationalists like to push Sino supremacy. We're more enlightened than the West. I think there is a kind of supremacy going on there. We're better. We're the Middle Kingdom. You can't mess with China. Um, and I think a lot of it is looking at century of humiliation, like the European powers, Japan. They humiliated us in the 19th century. I think it's kind of vengeful. Well, now we're powerful. Now we're going to throw our weight around. But if China wants respect, if China wants to be treated as a trading partner, if China wants respect on the world stage, it has to change its direction. I think that there are some cracks starting to appear, and I think it's possible that China is weaker than it might seem. I'm not saying it's weak, it's a powerful country. But I think it's a mistake to assume it's just this big monolith that cannot be touched. There is a lot that can be done. A lot that can be done. We can close the Confucius Institute. We can insist the Chinese nationals in the West they respect the host nation, which means, as far as I'm concerned, not waving the Chinese flag at nationalist demos and demanding respect. What's happening in Canada, particularly, is very concerning. In the recent Canadian election, there was evidence of Canadian legislators being threatened by people, whether they were Chinese Canadians or Chinese nationals who were interfering. I don't know, but they were threatening politicians, particularly on the conservative side, who were arguing for a more robust approach of China. Um, and one thing I think is particularly dangerous in the West is our sensibilities about things like racism. Of course, that's something that we take serious, and we should. But it is extremely dangerous to conflate, for example, anti-Chinese racism with legitimate criticism and concern about the CCP and about Chinese nationalism. Now, as far as I'm concerned, if a Chinese national is in the West studying or whatever, and they are joining a nationalistic demo, this has happened several times, um, they have no right to demand respect because they're showing none. How would they feel if a British citizen or a Canadian citizen or an American were to wave their flag in their country? And of course, the left get all, they clutch their pearls and say, oh, you can't say that. That's racism. Insanity. Every country has a right to protect its national interests. Every country, more specifically, has a right to expect some level of respect. And what China needs to understand is it works both ways. I think they are relying on the fact that because they're such a big economic powerhouse, that other countries rely on them. Well, we need to show that we're not overly reliant on them. I've always said I don't think we can cut off links completely, but I think we can reduce it. I think we can reduce reliance. Um, but this isn't going to go away. It's like pan-Islamism. This, these tensions with China, unfortunately, given the current direction of Xi Jinping and his party, they're polarizing China. And I think that unfortunately, so long as that is the situation, we cannot be apathetic. So if there's a new Cold War, it's one of China's making because of its decision to use increasingly aggressive wolf warrior diplomacy. In the Cameron era, it was believed that kind of, we think of this analogy of carry a big stick softly, and in the Cameron era, it was very much on the softly side. Well, we'll talk about human rights behind closed doors, but we'll be very, we'll roll out the red carpet and we'll essentially suck up to them. Let's not gloss over it. That's what they were doing. I think that is one of the biggest foreign policy mistakes of the Cameron era, pandering to Beijing to that extent. And I think if things turn out like they did in the 1930s, Cameron might be seen in the same light as Stanley Baldwin. For example, when Baldwin in 1935 signed the British-German naval agreement. I think the Johnson administration is more hardline, more assertive. Boris Johnson himself, I don't know. I think Johnson flip-flops. I like the fact Liz Truss seems to be taking a tough stance. But people who conflate this with racism are utterly deluded. Criticizing the government and criticizing disrespectful nationalism on our shores or Chinese nationalists engaging in bullying is not racist. What would be racist if I was to say, well, all Chinese are the enemy, they're all the same, and kind of collectively vilify them? I'm not doing that, and I never would. I think there's lots of Chinese students who are just ordinary young people who want to study, they want to, have their experience here. And I have absolutely nothing against those young people. I've worked with them. That's a community I know very well. I've worked with them. But I've also seen what's happening. I've interviewed a Hong Kong student who was, directly saw these threats, so I know what's going on. And I just think we need to send out a message that we're not going to be pushed around. If Beijing barks, then we need to retort in kind. I don't mean get to the petty level, but I mean, for example, if China makes a false smear against this country, or if one of their editorials smear us, I think we need to robustly hit back. I think sometimes the British have a habit of understating things, disappointed, or that is not the language we would use. We need to be a bit more blunt. We need to tell it like it is. Anyway, I'm going to round this up. I hope things don't escalate in that part of the world, but there is a danger here that mainland China will see Taiwan as vulnerable and soft right now. So it's critical that the United States, Japan, and other powers give assurances to Taipei that they won't be alone. Otherwise, we'll see a repeat of history.